woulda, shoulda. We've all said it, right? I could have done that. I could have, I don't know, I could have done something, and I would have too. If only I'd done something else or hadn't done something else. I don't know. But I shoulda. I shoulda. We've all had that thought. And I had that thought when I was a kid. I had a dream of paddling around Tampa Bay. I used to carry a canoe paddle around. I still do, actually, as you see. My dream really was to paddle a canoe more than any reason because I could afford a canoe and I couldn't afford anything else. So I dreamed of the canoe when I found out I could get one for 50 bucks. And I dreamed, and in my imagination there was a beautiful young girl waiting on a dock, and she was going to fall in love with me when I pulled up. But you know, I just never did it. It never happened. Life happened. War happened. College happened. I fell in love. I got married. I had children. And I never got around to following that dream. But years later, 50 years later, in fact, I had another dream. And that dream occurred right here at the University of North Georgia. And I was doing research and teaching. My research involved the rivers of North Georgia, the Chattahoochee River primarily, but also the Etowah. The Etowah is one of my favorite rivers. And it just so happens that the water divide for these two rivers occurs here at the UNG campus, or part of it does. So I was intrigued by that, and I began to imagine I could connect those rivers. If I could paddle down one and somehow get across the Gulf. That wasn't clear in my mind, but somehow get down the Gulf and get to the other. I could come back up it, and I would have connected them. That was my dream. But somehow, things just got in the way, and mundane things of life happened until one night I got a phone call from the Veterans Administration, and the Veterans Administration doctor had a lot of things to say. I didn't quite get all the words, but I heard words like unusual blood numbers and Agent Orange exposure from Vietnam and further tests, and I sort of quit listening about there. And so as soon as I got off the phone with this man, I got on the internet and I began to research some of these terms. I researched blood numbers, Agent Orange, and I kept coming up with the same thing, exactly the same thing. And that was chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And that was kind of upsetting. I went through a day or so of being kind of scared and kind of upset. But then I turned those lemons into lemonade, and I began to plan this trip. Matter of fact, the dream I had was of gently coasting down the river, not working too much, maybe not even picking up the paddle. I was just going to glide, okay? And by the time I got in for the additional test, I already had pretty well processed all this, so I was no longer frightened. And the doctor told me what was going on, told me I'd be okay for a while. Chemo was out there in the future. So I took that information and I began to plan this trip. And the trip really, when I began to map it, I realized it wasn't quite what I thought it was. It involved 550 miles going down one river system, 200 miles along the Gulf. Still wasn't sure how that was going to work. But I figured I'd deal with that. Other people have paddled along the Gulf, so surely I could. And then come upriver. How hard could that be? It's only 760 miles, as it turned out. And other people had done it, people almost my age. So that was the plan. And like any academic, I thought, I could turn this into a sabbatical, you know? You know, that's one of those uniquely academic institutions where we get a year off or a semester off, sometimes with pay, sometimes with not. I parlayed it into a year with pay. It just took a little doing. And I took my plan to the university and talked to the administration, pled my case, told them how wonderful this would be for the university. And I probably didn't mention the fun I was going to have, but I made it sound to them like This was going to be the greatest thing that ever happened to the university. I would write papers, I would give talks, I would bring praise upon the university. And if I wasn't here, I wouldn't be embarrassing them like I occasionally do. So they actually thought it was a pretty good idea. I did beg a little perhaps, but they gave me approval. And I began to really plan the trip in earnest. The scientific part of the trip, the part that I sold the administration on, was a Lagrangian sampling scheme. That is, I was going to follow a slug of water from the headwaters all the way down to the Gulf, down the Chattahoochee River to the Florida line, and then on into the Apalachicola River to Apalachicola Bay. And it was really something that could only be done out of a canoe. The state, of course, I planned it that way, so I'd have to paddle my canoe. After all, it was really about having a good time, right? And convinced the boss that I was working. So I planned this part out. I got some instruments from the state of Georgia, bought a lot of equipment, bought a lot of freeze-dried food. I still wasn't sure how I was going to get along the coast, but I figured I'd deal with that when I got there. I did buy a sail rig for the canoe, and I practiced with it a little bit. Turns out that's kind of neat, as long as you have outriggers. And then once I got to Mobile Bay, I'd turn upriver and come back up the Mobile, the Alabama, the Coosa, and the Etowah rivers back to Dahlonega, back to the North Georgia campus. So that was the plan. On September 22nd, 2012, I put the plan into action. My wife, Kathy, and several friends went with me. We went up to the base of Brasstown Bald, walked over the divide where the Appalachian Trail runs, and then down the hill to the spring that is the source of the Chattahoochee River. And here I am at that spring. There's a common watering source for through hikers on the Appalachian Trail. It's very careful to take my water samples and then put a small amount of dye that's approved by federal and state governments for this very purpose. It's non-toxic in the quantities I used, and it disappears very quickly. You have to detect it with instruments. And I had that instrument from the state of Georgia. The other folks went back by car, and I went on foot down through the woods and down to Helen. Kathy supported me, met me with equipment, and we got through Helen, and then I put my canoe in the water. The canoe was loaded with about 350 pounds of gear, and you see some of it out here on the rock. I very quickly fell into this routine of testing the water, then paddling downriver, and then I'd stop and I'd wait on the dye to come. And when the dye arrived, according to the instruments, I'd test the water again, jump in the boat, paddle, 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 head on down the river, catch the dye again. It worked pretty well. At night, it turned out, I had to stay up pretty much all night. I'd sleep for 30 minutes. My internal alarm would go off. I'd get up and I'd go test for dye down at the river. When it arrived, which I don't know why I didn't plan better, but it almost always seemed to be at 2 or 3 in the morning. And then I'd sample, and then I'd get a couple more hours sleep, load it all up, head on down the river. Became a good routine. I did catch up on sleep when I'd get to a reservoir, because I couldn't really test there. I'd reintroduce the dye below the reservoir. Eventually, we got some good results. I presented these results at conferences, written the papers that I promised the university I would write. That made them happy, and it was okay with me. The data are out there. It's done a little good for some people. It really confirmed what we thought we knew. But science is like that. You don't just assume that you know what you think you know. You go test. You gather data. That's what science is all about. For me, the trip was more about the beauty, about enjoying what I was going to see along the way, meeting interesting people. This is Neptune. I swear to you, I came around a bend in the river, and here's a stump, and it looked just to me like Neptune saying, go this way. So I went that way. He was pointing the right way. I did paddle a little bit at night. It was frightening the first time, but it's certainly beautiful. A little sliver of a moon there. Quite peaceful, not many people out there. I went through a lock. I went through several locks. Corps of Engineers was still operating them. Nothing quite as intimidating as being in this cavern intended for barges and tugboats in a little bitty canoe and feeling kind of out of place. And the lock operator was standing up there saying, "You okay down there?" It was kind of fun, actually, and it beat walking. Eventually, I made it to Apalachicola Bay. Kathy met me there. We had a 3-day respite, and then she took all the scientific gear. And I just sort of checked in with the administration from time to time and said, yep, still working out here. And I started trying to figure out how to get down the Gulf Coast. I had the sail rig, so I wanted to be outside where I'd get some good wind, but I really didn't know where I'd sleep. I thought, hey, it's all developed, right? And where am I going to sleep? It turned out there were lots of campsites. I wouldn't have imagined. These are places you just don't see in a car. Little islands here, an Air Force base there. Oops, did I say I camped on an Air Force base? State parks. I did get permits to stay in the state parks. And eventually I got on down where I was offshore one day, and a pod of dolphins came along. And this is quite a pod of dolphins. It was like a bunch of teenage boys. They were rolling closer and closer to the boat, and they were like daring each other. And finally, this one dolphin, he comes up and he slaps the bow of my canoe with his tail. And now, I don't speak dolphin, but I know what went on is that guy, just before he did it, he said, hey, y'all, watch this. And then, boom, they took off, okay? It was a magical moment. Eventually, I did reach Mobile and turn north, heading upriver. As I got into the Mobile River, I began to realize, hey, this is actually hard. The current's going the other way. Who knew? And I developed some technique. You stay to the inside of the bends. You stay behind rocks and stumps, call those eddies. And then there were dams. I would come to these dams, and now I'm going upstream. So the dam portages were uphill rather than downhill. Most of them were mercifully short, maybe a quarter of a mile or so. A few like this one were in the woods. This was 2.5 miles, as I recall, on sandy trails and over rough terrain. But I turned it into lemonade again. I would take a break, lay out in the leaves in the sunshine. I think it was November or December by the time I was here, so that sunshine was nice. I did have to carry from time to time. It would normally take me 6 carries, occasionally 7, depending on how much stuff I had with me. I carried the boat and a little bit of stuff on my back and then come back for another load. But I don't think I ever carried more than a quarter of a mile, so that wasn't too bad. Good exercise. I had great campsites. The campsites were as much as I could on public property. I didn't want to intrude on people. When I did have to camp on private property, I either got permission, or if I couldn't find an owner, I just made sure I wasn't around any no trespassing signs and not around anyone's house. I didn't want someone looking out the window saying, hey, what's that old man doing out there? And I always cleaned up. I practiced no trace camping, and I look for any trash that was already there, and I pick it up. That makes me feel good. It's a very selfish act, picking up trash. Eventually, I got on up near the headwaters. I've been told I couldn't do this. My friends who were paddlers said, the last 30, 40 miles, you're not making that. It's too steep. The current is too fast. There are too many rapids, waterfalls. Etowah Falls is 8 feet high. You just can't do it. They didn't know I'd bought these boots, okay? And my plan was get out of the boat and wade and drag it. How hard can it be? I'll only be out of the boat 15, 20 minutes, then I'll get back in, paddle, paddle, paddle. I exercised out of the boat more than half the day, the last 2 days. My feet would go numb, then my legs would go numb. I'd have to start watching my feet to make sure I didn't stick them in a hole and break my leg, because I figured I'd never feel that coming. But I did. I was careful. I looked where I was going. A good friend of mine, Richard Grove, came along, and he would get upriver of where I was going to be that day, and he'd cut trees out of the river. Great friend. Good guy. So I made it. I was so close to my goal. I was focused on my goal. I just kept going, kept plugging away, in spite of the discomfort and the pain. And then on February 14th, 2013, I swear to you, I got a Valentine's kiss. I came around a bend, and there were my friends, my wife. My daughter and her wife had come over from Alabama. A lot of friends had gathered. And it was an incredibly emotional finish to the trip. I still remember it. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, like I do thinking about walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge into Selma, Alabama. A lot of good memories from the trip. So I guess I would kind of wrap it up here by addressing what does it all mean? What did this trip mean? To me, I did a lot of thinking. I thought about how I had lived my life up to this point. I thought about what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And I will say, one of my great successes in the trip is I'm living my life that way now. And I thought some of the big thoughts. Who am I? Why am I here? Yeah, I never figured that out. But at least I thought about it. I have some ideas, but how do you really answer that question? So those are the questions that I faced. And I actually looked back to that coulda, woulda, shoulda idea that had disappointed me so much. And I thought, you know what? I coulda, and I woulda, and I actually did. So my question to you is, what dream do you have? What's been back there? What's your canoe trip? What's your Appalachian Trail hike? Do you dream of writing a book? How about keeping a set of diaries and then giving them to your children? Or not. Maybe you'll just burn them. I don't know. You know, maybe go get another college degree or get that first college degree. You have a dream, you know you do. That's the thing that comes up when you're stuck in traffic or you're stuck in a boring meeting. We all have those. So, what would it take for you to do that? Is it really important? Is that dream important? This dream was tremendously important to me. Martin Seligman said that one of the great satisfactions of life is being involved in a big project, something bigger than yourself, being in flow, as he called it, and then achieving something. Apart from what the something is, that achievement itself is tremendously rewarding to the psyche. And you know that. You've had those achievements. So this dream you have, what would it take? Is it going to take a midnight call from your doctor? Is that what it's going to take? Or maybe you should just do it. What do you think? Should you? You know the answer. You know. Thank you.